Welcome back. Now, the International Trade Administration Commission is set to review and make recommendations on the improvement of South Africa's tariff structure for steel products. This in a process that might lead to an increase in customs duties to protect the embattled local industry. And joining us for a look into what we can expect in the review is ITAC's Chief Commissioner, Ayabonga Cawe. Thank you so much for your time, Ayabonga. Talking about the embattled steel industry, is this tariff review not too little too late, considering how deep in the hole the South African steel industry has sunk?
Good afternoon, Zinati, and good afternoon to your viewers. Well, I think our view is to the extent that any instrument can be deployed to not just play a role in defending the survival of the sector, but advancing it in line with our industrial outcomes, we believe there are things we can do and ought to be doing. This is not a new crisis for the South African steel sector. 20 years ago, even prior to the privatization, or I guess the sale of the main primary integrated steel maker to the Metal Group at the time, as it was known. Even their annual reports were indicating, as early as 2002, the challenges they were confronting with a structural capacity overhang in the market that was arising from a lot of the capacity that had come from the Eastern European communist bloc that was now being unleashed into the global market and effectively creating a supply glut. So many of these structural issues are not new in the steel sector. And I think our steel sector has been around for close on 100 years now and has certainly faced episodic and periodic crises. Our worry, though, as Zinati, is that our sector is producing, from an installed capacity perspective, at around the same levels we were at, in the late 70s, early 80s, and right through into the 90s. And similarly, our demand profile has not grown in a way that would incentivize massive expansions in capacity. And then, of course, you introduce the complicated role of imports, certainly since the ascension of China to the WTO in 2001. And it's quite clear that what role this China effect has had. And so for us, more than happy to share, I guess, our own reading of that context. But really, our sense is that this is not the final death knell of the steel sector. We have a crisis, a national crisis. The AMSA problem is a constituent part of that crisis. But I think that crisis, in order for us not to waste it, presents opportunity for us to begin to signpost what the future of the steel sector might look like.
And I guess also some questions on the side, which we will not delve into today, is the steel sector in South Africa worth saving, considering the global landscape and the value chain in which it sits? So let's talk about, the daunting task that you have ahead of you. How far does the scope stretch?
So the scope stretches across a few tariff chapters, looking at upstream kind of primary steel products, midstream product, and downstream products. So that's anything from kind of your flat primary product, billets, ingots, and so on, right through to some of the more specialized downstream coils, screws, bolts, nuts, tubing, and so on. And we are not only undertaking Zinati tariff review, we are also undertaking a review of the policy space afforded to us in line with the commitments we have under the World Trade Organization. And we are also saying, in relation to that, what are these problematic categories of steel product where we should also consider placing these under some form of import permitting. One of the products we often make the example about is some of the kind of informational asymmetries and uneven standards arbitrage on products like sheeting used for corrugated iron roofs and coated products of that kind, many of which are coming in, and sometimes the specifications or even the standards might not necessarily meet what domestic producers need to comply with. And you can imagine the implication for many of those who use those structures for atypical dwellings in our informal settlements, and even modular structures in the construction and industrial sector. So there are some products where the argument is also from an environmental and a safety basis. Do you need to at least assure ourselves as a country, prior to the importation of specific categories of product, based on who it is uses them downstream, do we need much greater assurances, not just in kind of licensing the importation, but even checking things like compulsory specifications and compliance with standards. So that the review is broad in that sense.
Yes.
And also I think the review has been tasked with considering whether we need, following the institution of anti-dumping and other safeguard measures in cases of unfair trade, do we need to have some kind of surveillance after the institution of the measure? So we put in place anti-dumping duty today, and we often find in some investigations that subsequently follow circumvention. And circumvention is what? I put in a duty against an exporter from Malaysia. I find out tomorrow that there are exporters coming in from Indonesia who are a related party to the person who I was trying to put the measure against. And so in a way, we need to build up our own capability to be able to, one, put effective protection in place, and then be able to enforce that that protection is giving us the desired outcome, which is to kind of deal with the injury arising from unfair trade, and to also give our own industrial producers in steel at least some protective cover that allows them to acquire certain capabilities while still maintaining an impulse of competition to be able to compete globally.
Understand the injury imposed by cheaper steel imports on the local steel industry, but also from the perspective of steel importers in South Africa. Looking at this kind of scope, are there any kind of adverse trade shifts that could come as a consequence of this review?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, Zinati, one of the areas I completely forgot to share is that this is not just about some kind of crazed autarky on our end to just raise tariffs.
Yeah.
This review is also considering rebates. You would know that a rebate is where we do have a tariff in place, but where we understand that any of the upstream producers do not meet the product diversity needs or kind of specifications that the customer might want, we create provisions in Schedule 4 of the Customs and Excise Act for people to bring those products in under rebate.
Okay.
And so this review will also be considering that rebate. Now, many of those who use these rebates also employ a lot of people. They bring in kind of specialty grades and other grades we don't produce of steel. They fabricate that, they roll that, and they kind of forge it into different products that are used across a wide array of sectors: agriculture, the water infrastructure sector, and many others. And so I think this is about a whole of the value chain type of approach. We've got to look at what structure we have of the steel sector today. I think a lot of what occupies the public discussion is the crisis at AMSA and some of the overcapacity issues in the primary realm. But often we don't factor into the discussion some of the midstream and downstream interests and some of the complications that are being confronted there. And I think that this review gives us that opportunity as we quiz the public, but also as we begin to kind of get a much better sense of what's in our toolbox that we can deploy in synchronous fashion to be able to not just provide effective protection, but serve as a steer for, one, the recovery of the sector, and ultimately, I think, the expansion and advance of the sector behind a national strategy.
Just as we wrap up the conversation, you talk about AMSA, and of course, that's been one of the major triggers for this rush for emergency solutions. Could the implementation of these measures be quick enough to save that business?
Well, look, I don't want to speculate, Zinati, and I think the sum total of the AMSA problem is not only confined to the viability of their long steel business and some of what you see in Newcastle and Vereeniging. We've been engaged with AMSA even on some of their other applications they would have with us across a wide range of other steel products that do not fit the profile of what is produced at Newcastle and Vereeniging. We've also seen some strong kind of recovery in their flat steel business, and I think that this is public knowledge. Many people would have seen it in the interim numbers they put out towards the end of the year. And so in a sense, the AMSA challenge at a Newcastle and Vereeniging level, but even at the level of the group, is a very sizable constituent part of our national steel crisis. We also, I would argue, have in other grades that have nothing to do with AMSA, like stainless steel, similar challenges of structural overcapacity. We produce, or we have the capacity to produce, so much more steel than we have a demand for in the country. And this is where I think the demand side of the discussion, our review is mostly on the supply side, as you will see. But I think the demand story is a big part of how you not only recover the sector, but also lay the basis for its advance. And I think that's where gross fixed capital formation or fixed investment by main spenders in the state, which is municipalities and SOCs, and also main spenders in the private sector on construction, real estate, water infrastructure, the rail, and many of those other arena of reform that we often talk about. I think part of that discussion around reform has to be about proper demand signaling, such that you can then complement some of what we are trying to consider on the supply side, and to some degree stemming and managing the import profile on the demand side with some of those demand side things that can improve the order books of an AMSA, and of course many other players in the marketplace who produce a wide variety of grades of steel product.
Yeah, indeed. You are absolutely correct. We do need to look at this from a holistic point of view, and we will be looking out for the outcomes of that review. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights on that very, very important topic, Ayabonga. That was Ayabonga Cawe, Chief Commissioner of the International Trade Administration Commission.